Previously, if you had asked me the question, hey Kev, what is your favorite play you've ever seen made in a competitive Pokemon battle? I would have said, without question, it's got to be Ruer's Choice Band Tyranitar pursuing Blue's Mienshao. It's extraordinary. Cannot praise it highly enough. It was extraordinary back then, and it's still extraordinary now, but back then, part of the reason it was so incredible was that it pretty much introduced a new level of play to the game that previously was almost unthinkable. You know, it really took us to new heights, and I cannot praise it enough. However, McMegan has already made an excellent video on this, and I encourage you to check it out. So anything I would do would be redundant, besides, of course, just mentioning how insane it is. So check that one out. I'll leave the link in the pinned comment. But then I got to thinking. I still think Ruer's play is probably the best I've ever seen. But I don't know if it's my favorite. I mean, number 2 for sure. But I got to thinking about a turn that was very formative for me. And it was a turn that impacted me without even seeing the battle. Just hearing it described. Because all you really need is the context. I still have not even read the log of the battle that happened. I don't even know who the second player in the game was. But the first player was Earthworm, who I consider, possibly the greatest player ever. Before, that used to be a much less contested title for him. But he is undeniably one of the most elite to ever do it. And a turn like this was a big reason why. So, quick context, this took place during Gen 4 as the current gen. And I don't know if any of you are DPP experts, but let me tell you, when Skarmory comes out, generally the first thing it does is spike, right? Now, jokes aside, when you get your Skarmory in, you want to put on as much pressure as possible. So the best move is often the obvious move, to spike. Now, if you are a little on the conscientious side, like you think, oh, there might be a Magnezone, or, you just want to scout the opponent's team more, then you might go for a Whirlwind. So you see what happens and rack up more damage on the opponent if rocks are already up. That's generally the better way to do it. And another reason why it's better to put rocks on a non-Scarred Pokemon, if you can help it, of course. Some teams you just gotta, but it is generally better for Skarmory when it has that freedom, to either spike or Whirlwind or double switch. That's just as good. Although Whirlwind can potentially put the opponent in a more compromising position because you might reveal more of their team than they're ready to reveal. Like, you Whirlwind, oh, look, there's a Lucario on turn 5. Well, that's good to know. Things like that. And, even Pokemon that are less drastic with their reveal, like, it's like, okay, well, there's a Flygon, big deal. Then that starts suggesting parts of their team that you don't know. Like, that if they have this Pokemon for these purposes, like, oh, well, he's got this kind of DD tar check, so the last slot is less likely to be a hard counter to it. Just as a silly example off the top of my head. Or, the other way around is more reliable generally. It's like, oh, well, I'm seeing a bunch of Pokemon. I'm not seeing any answers to Gyarados. That last slot better be able to deal with it in some way. That narrows it down. How can I figure it out? And figuring out last is a big part of DPP. And even if not figuring it out precisely, then maneuvering around in the dark, so to speak, is a really big deal. And it's the better you are at it, the better you are at the generation. That's one reason I love DPP. It's that it really rewards experience with the tier. Which, this is not to say anything against Team Preview, which also, of course, that dynamic is very present there. But it's very unique in DPP, and it's also present in Advance, for sure. It's a similar dynamic where you got to know the tier in order to be able to figure out what your opponent does have, even if you haven't seen it. So this is the context, right? Now, the turn in question, the time is September 2010, and Black and White have just been released, and it is very controversial because we have just learned that there's this mechanic called Team Preview. And, yeah, well, this was outrageous upon release. Like this thread that I'll also leave a link to in the pinned comment. I'll keep the replay playing before I get more into it, but just so you know what we're going to be getting into. Yeah, I cannot emphasize enough how furious people were over this, because in Gen 4 as the main gen, that was the skill, dealing with the unknown. And obviously there's much unknown to be dealt with, even in Team Preview gens, of course. But the fact that you see the opponent's 6 Pokemon at the beginning, that people were going nuts over that. And that set the stage for this post made by Hitmonlee, which I will now detail. And then we'll get back to the replay. Don't worry, it has a cracking conclusion for those who are keeping up with it. So, I'm not going to talk about the part about how people were upset about Team Preview rooting the game. I personally did also not enjoy Team Preview when it came out. And if you ask me, do I prefer Team Preview or no Team Preview, I gotta say no Team Preview. That's how I like it. But, I'm old. It is a preference thing, not a skill thing. I think it's a very different type of skill. And I like the stuff I just mentioned about DPP. But yeah, I also have to make that video. And I know I say that a lot in these videos, but there's just so much stuff to make. It's wonderful. So, here we're going to quickly go to this part, not the turn in question. In previous gens, being able to more accurately deduce your opponent's team would win you games is a key skill that separates the best players from the average players. Now, of course, the rest of the posts, we now know, yeah, of course, you have to be able to deduce the opponent's sets from their team composition as well, and that is also very skillful. But the sentiment is pretty much what I just described. So, earlier in Hitmonlee's post, then he also mentions, the knowledge of your opponent's team and how you can use that to, or your opponent's knowledge of your team, because he gives the example of Salamence choosing between a dragon move or a fire move, and that's precisely when you can pivot Heatran in, because you know that the odds of Brick Break or Superpowering or Earthquaking are much lower. And so at this time, I was still relatively new to the competitive scene, but I was eating all this stuff up, and even that idea left an imprint on me. So I really have to thank Hitmonlee for this post, because years later I was playing a bunch of tournaments and I was using Mixed Dragonite a lot, and I really kept that kind of idea in mind. Like, I wasn't saying, oh, I've seen Swampert and Skarmory, so I will superpower now, but just that kind of thinking about what your opponent has and how they're going to answer it. It's a really good way to think. Or, let me rephrase that, because that makes it sound like I'm advocating for one thought process. It's a really good thing to consider, because in order to get past your regular... Let me just get the replay going again, because this might go on for a while. But in order to get past your regular thought processes, where you say, oh, well, I'm making... I even saw this comment recently. I don't remember exactly what it was. Maybe it was on Discord. I don't even remember. But someone was saying something like, hey, I had this game recently, and I had a good matchup, and I was making correct plays, or no incorrect plays, no bad plays, something like that. But the end of the game came around, and a few turns went a few ways, and I lost. What happened? How did that come about? And that's the kind of thing where if you always are stuck in those thought processes of playing it safe, playing it easy, then you really will get stuck in these kinds of traps where you'll lose and you barely even know how it happened. And that's because you didn't consider more possibilities beforehand. So, what's the easiest dichotomy ever? It's like attack or switch, right? or if you're dead set on staying in, move 1 or move 2. And if you're considering switching, it's usually to one Pokemon, right? But as soon as you start opening that kind of thought process up to, oh, what happens if I use this move that isn't so immediately obvious? I can either close combat the Heatran, or I can Fire Blast the switching in Gengar as Infernape. But, are those necessarily my only 2 moves? If I switch, it might be to Swampert. Oh, but what happens if I switch to something else, like Latias? I'm just throwing examples out there just to get the thought process going. So I really like that part of Hitmonlee's post already. Anyway, the rest of this game is just Lucario copycat spamming. Someone also asked recently in a comment, like, how did copycat get nerfed? And the idea, to my recollection, but you can't spam copycat roar anymore. You have to, because I think copycat fails? Yeah, I believe it fails if it, on multiple uses, if choiced. So, or it might just be multiple uses in general. Yeah, but this kind of thing can't happen anymore. Anyway, we're finally going to get to the turn, 11 and a half minutes in. Just once this finishes. Oh, we saw Sinclef, that's hilarious. This is a good set, I think. And then a close combat, and down it goes. Yeah, okay, so here's the turn. So, I quote, "There was an incredible turn in one of his World Cup matches where Earthworm sent out a Skarm and for seemingly no reason selected Brave Bird and caught an unrevealed Breloom trying to switch in." Now, this just blew my mind. It's an easy idea to have it blow your mind, but it's not just a flashy play like, oh, let me... because, first of all, Earthworm is the least flashy player in existence. He was so methodical and consistent that other people were annoyed and bored with his playstyle at the same time. And that's, so that, number one. But number two, even if it was just an insane play, like someone just randomly clicked Draco Meteor into a Clefable, or that would be in a team preview gen. If someone randomly clicked, close combat into a Gengar and caught Heatran switching in, an unrevealed Heatran switching in, for example, that would be, oh wow, that was an insane play. And then you start thinking about it. Did that play have more to it? Because it's easy to just say, oh, well, how did he do it? How did Earthworm know to Brave Bird there? How did he, ascend to the, 9th dimension or whatever? He opened his third eye and all that other stuff. Yeah, well, how? And then you start thinking about it, and you're like, this was a move option like anything else. He could have spiked, he could have whirlwinded, he could have double switched. All of those would have been fine against a Breloom switch-in. And of course, since we don't have the game, we don't have the context for his team. We don't know. I assume this was early in the game. But that seems reasonable. But I don't think that his team was so badly constructed that he was thinking, I better not let Breloom switch in right now, or else I'm toast. Instead, he thought, oh, well, there was a lot to go on if he was willing to pass up spikes, but it meant a lot of things. So you take this one turn and you start thinking, okay, there's probably not going to be a Magnezone coming in, or maybe it was Shed Shell Skarm, who knows. But even if it is Shed Shell Skarm with Magnezone, I mean, but that's the thing. You're already getting the thoughts rolling, so it doesn't. You don't have to stumble upon the correct answer right away. But you were considering more possibilities than spike. Maybe whirlwind or double switch if you're daring. So then you start thinking, what does Brave Birding blindly do? What are Pokemon that switch into Skarmory often that are pressured by Brave Bird? So then you start thinking, okay, well, there's things like Heatran and Zapdos and Rotom, which don't care about Brave Bird. But then you think about several other common switch-ins. Now, it's not just Breloom either, but Infernape. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've seen Infernape switch into Skarmory as it spikes, completely for free, and then suddenly it's putting pressure on the Skarm team. And you don't even think twice about it as the Infernape user, generally, because it's like, well, of course Skarm is going to spike. I'm getting Infernape in for free, where else am I going to switch it in? So that and if it gets Brave Bird on the switch, it just gets absolutely destroyed. I've seen the Breloom into Skarm example less, but I mean, it's Spore, it's disruptive. Of course, it's a very viable option. And then you start thinking about it, because I was thinking about it when I was really getting more into tournament play. And Starmie was absolutely everywhere, and it was the #1 response to Skarmory. And because it wasn't, let me deal with Skarmory through offense, because that's difficult. But then you also have the method of dealing with Skarmory by removing its lefties, because Starmie famously hydro pumps Rotom and spins, and it's annoying. And if you just spike the Skarmory, spike as Starmie comes in, and then it spins, then you have done nothing. You can Whirlwind, you can double switch. But if you Brave Bird, then you open up a lot of options, because you're not just trying to Whirlwind and Scout Breloom or Infernape, because if you can KO them, fine. But if Starmie comes in, very possible, then you are able to put a lot of pressure on it. Let's say Rocks are up, let's say probably Sand is up as well, and you're knocking it down to around half health. Well, bulky Starmie. Offensive Starmie gets hit very hard. And suddenly, that Starmie, which exerts so much pressure on your Skarm team traditionally, then suddenly it's, on its last legs almost, if it's offensive. And so much of the problem has been dealt with already, right off the bat, because it thought it had a free switch in. And even defensive, it's going to be forced to recover. And that means if you want to get Rotom in there for spin block and force it out, that's great. If you want to get T-Tar in there, this is a perfect opportunity to trap it. So, and if it does, and if it doesn't recover, then it is sitting around half health, and that's very exploitable. So that's pretty much it. I really cannot emphasize enough how much of an impact this turn from a game I didn't even see had an effect on me. And of course, it's not just Brave Bird, Skarm, and Gen 4 OU. I mean, this isn't even from a metagame we play anymore, because this World Cup game was when Salamence was still legal. And then you start thinking about other things like, oh, well, what if Ment switches in? Hey, Ment switches in with Rocks up, it gets Brave Birded, yeah, it gets intimidated, but hey, now it's less than half health. I mean, this Brave Bird move, not for every situation, of course. I'm not saying that you completely upheave the idea of how Skarmory is used, but and just lead off with Brave Bird every time. But I'm saying just that consideration gives you a lot of different ways to think and different things to play with. And I think that's really excellent. And then you even start thinking about, hey, what if Rotom or Zapdos switches in? And I mean, this is game condition apparent, or dependent, obviously. But, those switch in with Rocks and Sand up. And yeah, you would have liked to have spiked, sure. But, you warded off the bigger threats in Breloom, Infernape, Starmie, the more immediate pressure guys. And then if Rotom and Zapdos switch in, hey, you still chunked him a little bit. And now that's their response. That's fine. You can deal with that. Zapdos probably going to have to roost anyway, so free switch. So that's more or less everything I wanted to say. Thank you for watching / listening. Yeah, this is just these kinds of plays, like the Earthworm Brave Bird, the Ruer Pursuit. We see more and more of these plays as the game goes on, as as it develops over time. As we learn from plays like these, and they, because nowadays, if you said that, oh, well, Ruer bluffed Scarf T-Tar and pursued the Mienshao with a Ban T-Tar, people would say, oh, wow, that's a good move. But I can see that, but it wasn't always like that. And when you have moves like this being made, in their own context, and then inspiring players to look for more ways that the game can be played, then you get more and more of these things. Like over the last several years, you see these plays like this all the time. It's like, oh, how did they think of that? How did that come to be the play? And it worked, and then you think about it, you're like, that was so smart. So, yeah, but for me, it all started with Earthworm using Brave Bird and KOing an unrevealed Breloom. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one.